Welcome, dear listener, wherever you are this evening, whether curled beneath soft covers, staring quietly into dark, or simply letting the noise of the world fall away. I'm so grateful you've chosen to be here. There is nothing urgent now. No clocks ticking loudly. No demands calling your name. Only stillness and story. Tonight, we step back into one of the darkest chapters of human memory. Into a time when the air itself felt heavy, when every cough in the village was a warning, and when the weight of the dead could no longer be counted by numbers, only by the silence they left behind. This is not a tale of kings or armies. It is quieter than that, darker than that. It is a story of a single man, one who dug, day after day, through soil soaked not with rain, but with sorrow. A man who buried others so often that he forgot what it felt like to speak to the living. This is the life of a gravedigger. In the year the world went still, when death did not knock, but marched openly through every door, and when the only certainty left was a grave. So take a deep breath, let the weight of the day slide gently from your shoulders, and follow me now, into the damp earth, into the quiet shadows, into the brutal, forgotten world of the Black Death. This is the brutal life of a gravedigger during the Black Death. The day never really begins with the sun anymore. It begins, as it has for many months now, with the slow, low toll of the iron bell that hangs from the skeletal frame beside the chapel, its voice dull and distant even when heard from inside the dark corners of a low wooden room, where the walls breathe with dampness and the air still holds the sleep of night. The bell doesn't call people to prayer, nor feast, nor even to shelter. Not anymore. Its sound has changed. It no longer rings with purpose but with surrender, with the weary echo of yet another death, another loss, another linen-wrapped body to lift and carry and lay beneath the soil. The man stirs in his bedding of straw and rags, bones cracking faintly as he shifts, not from old age, but from the stiffness that comes from sleeping too cold for too long, from a body that is fed enough to walk, but not enough to rest. He does not rise quickly. There is no reason to. The bell will ring again, and again, and again. There is no rush when the dead do not complain. His name is not written in any book, and few call him by it anymore. In the mouths of the townsfolk, he is simply the digger, or the cartman, or worse. He no longer minds. Not really. The living fear the dead, and they fear him too, for he walks among corpses, carries them like parcels, breathes the same air they exhale in silence. But he does not fear them. The dead are quiet, at least, predictable. They lie still. They do not betray. The room he sleeps in used to belong to a priest's assistant, or maybe a tanner's boy. He does not remember. The boy is long gone now, buried in the western hill, or was it the southern trench? There have been so many, and the names blur like water on parchment. The space is his now. His room has no lock, but no one enters. On the wall hangs a crude cross made from bent twigs and binding twine. He nods to it briefly, not with reverence, but habit. Then he swings his legs to the floor, the rush of cold hitting like a second bell. Outside, the air carries a scent of wet earth and faint decay. Not strong, not yet, but present always, like a whisper behind the wind. The sky, pale and unwilling, hangs low, not offering sun or rain, only the same blank light that has hovered for weeks, perhaps longer. He dresses in silence. His tunic is brown once, but now so soaked in soil, and sweat resembles nothing natural. His boots were patched last winter by a woman who died in spring. His hands are wrapped in cloth, not for warmth, but to keep the skin from splitting when it meets the shovel's handle, and to slow the spread of rot, if rot is ever truly slow. He steps outside and listens again. The bell has ceased. That means the body has been found, marked, and someone has left a token, a cloth strip on a branch, a plate on a doorstep, a quiet plea tied in ribbon. There is no need to speak. Everyone knows. The system is wordless now, like the work. He walks with the same pace he always walks, not fast, but not slow either. It is a pace of someone who knows there is no end to what must be done, and so there is no point in hurrying toward it. His cart waits, leaning slightly in the frostbitten ground, its wheels sticky with old mud and dried blood, its boards loose, groaning under weight even before weight is added. He checks the cart, tightens a rope that binds the sidewall, tests the axle for cracks. Then he lifts the long-handled shovel, the one with the worn grip, the indent from his own palm deep enough to feel like part of his body. A smaller spade lies beside it. For the children, he does not touch it yet. Instead, he begins to walk, past the broken stone fence, past a marker where last week's pile was laid and burned, past the place where wildflowers used to grow. Nothing grows there now. As he walks toward the village center, the houses seem smaller than they once were, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Their doors are shut tightly, windows boarded or shuttered. Chimneys cold despite the creeping chill in the air. He sees no one, not at first, though he knows they are watching. Behind curtains, through cracks, mothers clutching children too weak to move. Men sharpening knives for no reason but to keep their hands busy. Old women whispering prayers not out of faith, but from habit. Everyone is waiting for something to end. The plague, the harvest, the bells, life itself. He keeps walking. There is a body today. He does not yet know who it is. He never knows until he sees the face. But he knows where to go. The bell rang from the east quarter, near the Weaver's Lane. That's where the linen bundles appear most often now, tied and placed with care on the stoop or at the corner post. No one says goodbye anymore. No one stands beside him. He is both witness and burial party, priest and pauper, collector and farewell. He reaches a lane, and yes, the bundle is there, wrapped tight, thin, too thin. A child, perhaps, or someone elderly. He leans down, cradles the form gently, always gently. The cart groans as it accepts the weight, as if it remembers. He does not uncover the face yet. Not here, not where people might see. Later, in the field, when he prepares a grave, he will look. He always looks. Sometimes he remembers them, sometimes not. Sometimes he wishes he hadn't. But for now, he pulls the cart away again. Another turn. Another toll, another bell, and as the wheels roll back toward the path that lead beyond the village, to the place where the ground is no longer sacred but simply sufficient, he sees the fog beginning to rise again from the fields. It clings low to the grass, winding through the wooden markers like fingers, and in that cold silence, he realizes the fog does not rise because the ground is warm. It rises because the ground is full. And that is where he's going now, into that mist, to lay this one down, and perhaps one more after that. For in the quiet of the village, behind those shuttered homes, another call begins, and in the sky above, the bell hangs waiting. And so he walks into a village under a shroud. The mist does not merely settle in the village. It takes root, weaving through the thatched roofs and crooked chimneys like a spirit too tired to leave. It gathers along the edges of the stone paths and seeps into crevices between the wooden doors, resting like a shroud across a town that once whispered with life. But now there are no voices. No footsteps echo from the alleys. No children laugh between the barns. The gravedigger pushes his car along the path he knows too well, past the wells that no one draws from anymore, past the small herb garden that once filled the morning air with rosemary and thyme, but now lies frostbitten and forgotten. Everything seems wrapped in silence, not just from the absence of sound, but from the weight of so many things unsaid, grief that has grown too familiar to speak aloud, and fear that dares not give itself a name. There are houses with doors marked in ash, some with smeared chalk symbols that once meant protection or healing or hope, but now sit like unanswered prayers. Others are adorned with scraps of cloth, red, white, sometimes black, not to ward off death, but to declare it has already arrived. The village is not large, yet to the gravedigger, it stretches like a maze without exit, a tangle of ghost paths that lead to the same end. He passes the baker's home, where he once traded a patch on his boot for a half-loaf and a nod of kindness. The shutters are closed now. A cross leans against the wall, made from lopsided twigs and bound with torn thread. No scent of bread here anymore, only rot, faint but growing. At the corner near the tavern, which has not opened its doors in weeks, he notices a pile of straw that once cushioned a sleeping dog, now cold and undisturbed. The hound, like many others, vanished, fled to the forest or perished where no one saw. He remembers once, early on, seeing a child bearing a cat wrapped in cloth, carefully laying small stones over it as if it were a sibling. He had passed without speaking, not out of indifference, but because he had no words left that could do anything more than fill space. And this was no place for wasted breath. Each turn of the cart's wheel is met with the faint creak of old wood and the sigh of overburdened axles. There's a rhythm to it now, like breath, push, creak, pause, step, the kind of rhythm one learns when it is the only song left. He sees curtains twitch from inside homes, quick movements, just enough to mark that someone is alive in there, watching, waiting, but no one waves. No one calls out. Even the grateful do not speak. They simply leave the bodies outside, wrapped or not, tagged with little more than a gesture. A pair of shoes beside the door, a cup turned upside down. The gravedigger understands these signs. This new language of sorrow requires no voice. He stops briefly near the smithy. The forge, once roaring with life and iron, sits dark and hollow now, its soot-caked walls holding no heat. The smith was a strong man, one of the last of all. He fought the illness like a soldier, swinging his hammer until he collapsed. The gravedigger buried him with the hammer still in hand. It had seemed right. In this new world, symbolism still mattered. Not to the dead, perhaps, but to those who watched from behind closed shutters, clutching their own trinkets of hope. A hammer, a doll, a scarf. They were small comforts, but they were all that remained. He adjusts the cloth on the body in the cart, just enough to keep the face covered. Sometimes, the wind tries to lift the linen. Sometimes it succeeds. And when it does, he sees things he would rather forget. Open eyes, bruised lips, fingers curled in final, silent protest. But he never turns away. He believes the dead deserve a witness, even if their only witness is him, even if their name has already been lost, even if no one ever speaks of them again. This is his duty now, not by oath or title, but by necessity, and by the simple truth that no one else will do it. A door opens behind him. The sound is so rare, it halts his step. Slowly, he turns to see a figure, old, thin, wrapped in more layers than needed for the weather. The figure does not speak, but leaves a bundle by the steps and closes the door again. The gravedigger walks over, kneels. The linen is clean, folded with care. A flower has been tucked into the folds. Wilted, yes, but unmistakably a gesture of love. He lifts the bundle, adds it to the cart, and bows his head briefly. Not for prayer, not even for goodbye, but for recognition. Then, with the same slow pace, he moves on. The village narrows toward its eastern edge, where the thatch gives way to stone, and the old burial fields begin. Trees bend low over the path here, branches like arms drooping under the weight of time and watching. He hears the wind shift. There are no birds today. There haven't been for some time. Perhaps they too have learned to avoid the stench of sorrow. He walks the curve of the path and sees, ahead of him, the chapel gate, leaning rusted, its hinges long since surrendered to the rain. This is where he must stop. This is where the burial begins. The ground will be hard this morning. The fog has dampened the surface, but the earth beneath is stubborn, packed by too many recent disturbances. Graves cannot rest in peace when there are too many. He pauses, lets the cart rest against the old fence, and looks back once more toward the village. Smoke rises faintly from one chimney, the only sign of life. The rest lies still beneath the mist, swallowed in silence. And somewhere within that silence, behind some door or beside some bed, someone else will close their eyes today and never open them again. The village breathes its last in slow, shallow gasps, and he is the witness to it all. He turns, lifts his shovel from the cart, and steps toward the dirt. The work must begin. For today, again, he must prepare the tools of the dead. The shovel rests easily in his hand, as it always has, molded not by craft, but by the slow, unconscious shaping of repetition. Fingers curling along the handle exactly where the wood has worn smooth from hundreds of grips, palms knowing instinctively the balance between pressure and pull, between earth and bone. There are no secrets left in this tool, no surprises. Only the intimate knowledge of something used so often has become an extension of the self. The blade is dull at the corners now, not from neglect, but from exhaustion, like a man who has seen too much and speaks too little. And still, it cuts well enough to open the earth, well enough to close it again. That is all that's required. In the back of the cart lie the others. A pickaxe for when the ground resists and refuses to give. A short-handled spade, smaller, lighter, used when the graves must be close together. The kind he reserves for children. A folded cloth, brown from age and stained with the shadows of things long buried. Used sometimes to wrap faces when the linen tears or the bodies shift. A rope, knotted and fraying, for lifting or lowering or tying. A rusted lantern that barely holds its flame, swinging gently even now in a breeze, as though it breathes alongside him. And then, near the edge of the cart, his thick gloves, too stiff to protect from pain, but enough to give the illusion of it. These are not sacred things. They are not polished or hung upon hooks, not stored in cases or cleaned with reverence. They are tossed, stacked, shoved into corners. They're used without pause and sometimes without thought. Yet, in their own quiet way, they carry meaning. They're the only things that remain constant in a world that changes hour by hour, grave by grave. They do not weep. They do not shake. They do not fear. He trusts them more than he trusts the sky. As he lays them out in the trampled grass, each placed beside the open patch of ground where the next body will go, he cannot help but feel the weight of it all. Not just a literal burden of lifting and digging, but the symbolic one, the slow accumulation of sorrow that clings to these objects like dirt under fingernails. Each tool has its memory. The lantern, for instance, once lit the path through a snowstorm so fierce he thought he'd bury himself before the night was done. The cloth had been a part of the curtain, torn from a widow's home by trembling hands after her last child coughed his final breath. The rope, once part of a ship's rigging, traded by a sailor who wanted only food in return. These things bear witness, even if they cannot speak. He kneels now, pushing the shovel's blade into the ground. The first resistance is always the hardest, that stubborn upper layer, packed and frosted, crusted over with the memory of life. Beneath it softens. Beneath it yields. The sound of the shovel meeting soil is not sharp, not violent. It is muted like a sigh. He works in silence. There is no one to talk to, and even if there were, what would he say? That this is the 5th grave this week? The 20th this month? That he no longer dreams of anything but holes in the ground? The birds do not return. The mist thickens. Time loses meaning. A grave takes as long as it takes. Sometimes an hour. Sometimes 3. It depends on the stones. It depends on how far down he must go. The priest once told him 6 feet was holy, but the priest is gone now, and the ground is shallow, and the holiness of things has long since been covered by filth. He digs until there is enough space, and then he digs a little more just in case. He glances back at the cart. 2 bodies today. One large, one small. He'll place them carefully. He always does. Though the world may have abandoned dignity, he has not. Each body is unwrapped only enough to be recognized. A final glance, a silent farewell, a nod to memory. Then the cloth is pulled tight again, and the earth receives its due. Sometimes he talks to them. Not loudly, not with ceremony. Just a few words. "You're home now," he might whisper, or "You'll be warm down there." He doesn't know why. Perhaps it is for himself, a way to push back the creeping numbness that threatens to swallow his voice. Or perhaps he truly believes someone, somewhere, hears. He thinks of the tools again. He will need to sharpen the shovel soon. The blade catches more than it should. The pickaxe has splinters in the handle. Dangerous, if he's not careful. The lantern's oil runs low. The gloves might not last another week. He should mend them or find new ones, though there is no one left to trade with. Perhaps in the next village, if he dares go. But he won't. Not yet. Not while there is still earth to dig here. He wipes the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, smearing dirt across his face. The cold wind cools him quickly. He doesn't shiver. He doesn't feel much anymore. The grave is almost done now. He shapes the bottom with the short-handled spade, squaring the corners not out of necessity, but habit, the same way a man makes his bed or smooths the wrinkles from a coat before leaving home. It is an act of order in a world that is none. As he lifts the larger body from the cart and carries it in his arms, he moves slowly, reverently. The limbs shift slightly beneath the linen, but he does not flinch. He lays the body down. The second follows. A child, lighter than air. He places her beside the other, hands folded, head turned gently as if she merely sleeps. Then he begins to cover them, first with a layer of straw, then with soil. The rhythm returns. Scoop, pour, pause. The sound of dirt hitting cloth is soft, almost kind. The grave fills slowly. He does not rush. When the last mound is shaped, he leans the shovel against the fence and reaches for the cloth. He wipes his hands, cleans the tools one by one. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to say they are ready again. Enough to make them useful tomorrow. The lantern is lit. The rope is coiled. The spade is set beside the shovel. The tools of the dead return to their places, waiting, and as he pushes the cart back toward the path, back toward the next bell that surely waits to ring, the fog curls around him like a breath. The fields beyond are swallowed in pale gray, and he steps into them without hesitation, ready now for what must come next. For tomorrow, again, he will be digging through the fog. The fog thickens as he pushes the cart along the narrow path that winds beyond the graveyard, not toward the village this time, but toward the outer fields where the boundary stones are half swallowed by weeds and memory. The wheels creak and stick with each slow turn, churning over uneven stones, dried roots, and the clinging dampness that seems to rise not from the sky above, but from the very soil itself, as though the earth is exhaling softly, a long, cold breath filled with sorrow and centuries. Visibility narrows to just a few feet ahead. The cart fades into shadow even as he walks beside it, and for a moment, it feels less like moving forward and more like sinking, as though the mist is water and he is descending through it, one step at a time, into the belly of something that does not want him to leave. He can no longer see the chapel, nor the crooked fence posts that mark where consecrated ground ends and common land begins. Even the trees, whose gnarled fingers usually reach skyward with indifference, now seem to bow inward, their outlines softened and blurred by the veil of fog, as though ashamed of what they witnessed. The fog deadens sound, not in the way silence does, which still leaves room for thought, but in a way that makes even the creak of the cart or the scuff of his boots feel distant, muffled, like echoes from another life. The world shrinks in on itself, until it is just him, the cart, and the knowledge that someone somewhere is waiting for him to come and take what death has already claimed. These are the mornings when the work becomes something different. Not a task, not a duty, but a kind of ritual, private and sacred in its own grim way. The fog makes it easier. Sometimes. It hides the eyes of the living. So he doesn't have to see the shame, the helpless gratitude, or worse, the silent hope that it won't be their door he visits next. It hides the details, too. The sharp outlines of grief that come with a mother's hand still clutching her child, or a man's body left leaning against his own gate, because he had no one left to close his eyes. In the fog, it all becomes softer, less personal. The shapes are anonymous, and perhaps that is a mercy. But the fog also hides a path. And as the gravedigger presses forward, guided more by instinct than sight, he feels the cold fingers of uncertainty creeping into the edge of his thoughts. He has walked these routes so many times he can navigate them in darkness. Yet now, with the world reduced to shades of gray, even familiar ground feels foreign. Did he pass the mossy stump already? Was that the third crooked fence post, or the fourth? Did the cart will just slip into the old trench that once held floodwater? Or has a new rut been worn by his own endless comings and goings? Doubt is a rare companion for him. But today, it walks beside him in silence. He stops beneath what might be the remnants of an old oak, the outline barely visible through the swirling mist. Here, he thinks, is close enough. The message had been left on the chapel steps before dawn, a small strip of fabric tied with twine, a rough mark drawn in soot, the location scrawled on the back of a torn-in page. Eastfield. Old barn. That's all it had said. The barn has long since collapsed. Its roof surrendered to storms years before, its walls buckled like knees too tired to kneel. But it remains a landmark of sorts, the place where the sick were first taken when the town ran out of rooms, where the cries echoed against the rafters until even the strongest voices failed. He can't see it yet, but he knows it's near. He leaves the car on the path and walks ahead, shovel in one hand, lantern in the other. The flame flickers, tiny against the gloom, casting light that seems afraid to travel too far. The grass beneath his boots is wet, not from rain, but from the breath of the fog, and every step leaves a print that vanishes within seconds. He listens carefully. Nothing stirs. No birds. No animals. Not even the rustle of wind. Just the sound of his own breath and the soft rhythm of his footsteps. Then, ahead, he sees it, a corner of blackened timber jutting from the ground like a bone. The barn, what's left of it. And there, at the threshold, something else. A form wrapped, but only loosely, the cloth clinging damp to the shape beneath. Someone had laid them there, not hidden but not exposed, as if offering them back to the land with the quiet dignity of someone who no longer expects salvation. He kneels beside the body, adult, thin, fingers exposed, curled slightly, no sign of struggle, no markings. He adjusts the cloth, tightening it gently, brushing away the leaves that had gathered in the folds. He does not try to guess the story. That is not his place. He lifts the body and carries it back to the cart, placing it alongside the others already resting there. The cart accepts the weight without complaint. It always does. The digger pauses, letting the lantern's faint glow reveal the field around him, the barn, the path, the rise of the land where the trees begin again. He knows he should turn back, but something in the fog calls him onward, not with sound, but with feeling. The kind of pull that suggests there's more here. Another, perhaps just beyond the tree line, perhaps still alive. But the fog thickens again, curling tighter around his ankles and waist like chains of mist. He cannot see more than a few steps now. The light of the lantern shrinks. The cart disappears in the gray behind him, and for a brief moment he feels untethered. Not lost, not afraid, but suspended, as though time itself has paused, and he stands alone in a world made only of silence and smoke. Then a shape emerges. A small one, low to the ground. A second body. No wrapping this time. Just a child, cradled in the hollow of an old tree's roots. Face turned away, hands folded. Someone had tried to protect them. A scarf tucked beneath their head. A sprig of dried lavender laid nearby. He exhales slowly. These are the moments that crack something inside him, not with violence, but with a steady, dull ache that never truly heals. He kneels again, lifts the child gently, carries him back to the cart. The journey back through the fog feels longer than before. Each step is heavier. The cart creaks louder. The path is harder to find. But he walks it still, because this is a work, and there is no one else to do it. As the trees begin to part, and the vague outline of the chapel rises once more through the mist, he sees that the fog has not lifted. It has only followed. And in the days to come it will follow still, curling through fields and past graves, wrapping itself around the village like a second skin. For when the air itself carries the dead, even digging to the fog cannot clear it away. But dig he will, because the fog may be thick and the light may be dim, but somewhere beneath it all, the earth is always waiting. By the time the gravedigger returns to the edge of the village, the fog has begun to thin just enough for outlines to sharpen. The tops of crooked chimneys, the distant lean of the old bell tower, and most strikingly, the doors. They line the muddy paths like signposts of sorrow, each one bearing a mark, a smudge of soot, a smeared symbol, a crude cross carved with shaking hand, or in some cases, no mark at all but a silence so deep and deliberate that it becomes louder than any written plea. These doors are no longer barriers between the living and the world, but messages to those who pass, messages that speak of what has happened within, or what is feared will happen soon. They are the language of a dying community, one without paper or proclamation, one etched instead in symbols that are both desperate and resigned. At first, these markings have been meant as warnings, hastily chalk symbols drawn by town officials or clergy, identifying houses where the sick lay groaning in their beds, or where someone had fallen to the floor mid-prayer and never stood again. But soon, they became something else. Families began marking their own doors, not just to warn others, but to beg for something. Help, mercy, a clean death, a delay. Some would smear ash in the shape of a star, hoping it would fool whatever spirit carried the sickness into mistaking them for someone already claimed. Others left scraps of ribbon or cloth, old holy tokens, bits of iron, anything that might confuse or appease what they could not understand. The gravedigger walks past each door slowly, his eyes catching the details not in their fullness, but in impressions, the way an old painter might squint to see the shape rather than the line. One door has been blackened entirely, as if painted with smoke, its frame scorched at the base as though someone had tried to burn the contagion out and failed. Another bears small handprints in red ochre, the kind used in old festival dances, only now dried and cracked and far too still. There's a home with no door at all, only a blanket hanging limp in the archway, and beside it, a child's doll lying in the mud, its head tilted, its dress stained with rain, and something darker. Some of the doors are ajar, not flung wide in panic, but left open with care, as if an offering. These are the worst, for they often reveal just enough. A foot at the edge of the bed, a candle burned down to its final lump of wax, a silence so complete it presses against the ears. These are the homes where the dead have been waiting too long. The gravedigger pauses at each, stepping just inside the threshold, breathing shallowly through his cloth. He doesn't stay long. There's no need. One glance tells him everything. He works methodically. One home, then the next. He does not knock. There is no one left to answer. If he finds a body, he wraps it. If there are more, he notes it silently. He will return. Always return. His cart fills slowly, and the weight pulls heavier with each stop. Still, he does not skip a door. That is the rule he has given himself. Not out of righteousness, but order. Because once he begins to choose who to bury and who to leave, he will have become something less than human. Along the main lane, he stops before a house he once passed by daily without thought. It was yellow once, though now the color has faded into something with a shade of old bone. The mark on this door is different, a full circle drawn in ash, with lines inside it that suggest a sun or perhaps an eye. It is precise, carefully drawn, not the work of a desperate hand. He recognizes it, the symbol of an herbalist, a healer. This was Anna's house. She was one of the first to speak against the sickness, to name it, to defy the priest's quiet denial. She had kept working when others locked their doors, had offered her herbs, her boiled cloths, her tinctures made from things foraged in the woods. Some said she saved lives. Others whispered that she caused the sickness to stay. Either way, her door is marked now. The symbol has been crossed through with a thick slash of coal. He knocks once, gently, out of habit. No reply. He steps inside. The scent of dried herbs clings to the air, faint but still present, like a memory. The room is in order. A fire has long since died in the hearth, but the tools are still hung neatly, jars still stacked on shelves. There's a bed in the corner, and on it a form, covered in a patchwork quilt, hands crossed over chest. She has been prepared, not abandoned. He nods once, a silent gesture of respect, then steps back outside. The symbol remains, and he leaves it untouched. Some marks do not need erasing. As he returns to the path, a soft wind stirs the fog, lifting it just enough to reveal a row of doors along the next lane. Each bears its own message. A heart scratched into the wood. A cross made of twigs nailed crookedly in place. One with no mark at all, just a shoe placed carefully on the step. He walks on. There's something about the doors, their silence, their stubborn presence, that reminds him this village was once alive, that behind every frame was a voice, a breath, a life with rhythm. Now the rhythm is his, the push of the cart, the creak of the wheels, the steady, solemn knock of his boots on packed dirt. The doors pass by, one after the other, like chapters in a book written by hands too tired to hold a quill, and he reads them all without ever opening a page. At the edge of the lane, the cart is full again. He will need to dig, but before he turns back toward the graves, he sees something else, a new mark, freshly drawn in ash. A small house, untouched until now, and on the door, a message not of fear, but of invitation. A circle, open at the top, a line leading upward. The symbol is unfamiliar. He stares at it a moment longer than he should, and then slowly he begins to walk again toward the fields, toward the edge of consecrated ground. For the doors are marked now, and soon the earth will be too. The path narrows as it winds away from the rows of marked doors. past the boundary where the tidy graves begin to thin and scatter, and the soft, uncertain soil begins again. Here, at the edge of what the church once deemed sacred, the land shifts not in terrain, but in weight. The gravedigger feels it beneath his boots, that old, invisible line drawn not in stone, but in decree, a line whispered about in sermons and reinforced in superstition, beyond which no priest would bless and no bell would toll. The ground beyond this point, though made of the same clay and bone, does not belong to God, or so they said. Once, long ago, this division might have mattered. Once, people were buried with ceremony and words, in rows aligned toward the east, where the light of resurrection was meant to rise. Children in smaller plots, mothers beside their husbands, soldiers beneath carvings of swords and scripture. But that was when there was still time for order, still room for choice. Now, with each passing week, the graves crept outward, like a tide of silence slowly drowning the edge of holiness. The gravedigger pauses at the low wooden fence that marks this fading border, its beams gray with age and speckled with lichen. The paint had long since peeled away, and in some places, entire slats had fallen or been taken for firewood. But even in its ruin, it holds a kind of power, not because it prevents anyone from crossing, but because it reminds them where they are. To step beyond it is not just to leave the village, but to enter a space untouched by forgiveness. He has dug many graves beyond this point. He no longer asks whether it matters. The earth here receives the dead just the same. It does not reject the poor or the mad or the criminal or the unnamed. It swallows all without prejudice. But the villagers still feel the difference. The ones buried beyond the fence are not spoken of. Their names are not carved. No one visits to leave flowers or prayers. They vanish, not just from sight, but from memory. The gravedigger knows their faces. He remembers the old thief whose hands had trembled with every step, who'd once offered him a stale crust of bread in thanks. The midwife who had caught children for decades before being accused of witchery, when none survived that cursed winter. The man from the woods, nameless and mute, who wandered into the village one spring and fell to fever before he spoke a word. All of them laid to rest in silence. The dirt patted down without witness, the only sound the soft thump of falling soil and the slow creak of his knees. Today, he carries 4 more. The cart groans as he pushes it past the broken gate, wheels struggling against the tall grass that has grown wild here, undisturbed by foot or hoe. The fog lingers, clinging to the low ground like smoke from a dying fire. There is no wind, no birds, only the hush that seems to deepen the further he walks, as if even the air respects what lies beneath. He finds a clear patch, a low rise near the edge where the tree roots have not yet claimed the soil. It will be dry enough. Digging in wet ground is slow work, and the thought of turning the shovel amuck is enough to make his shoulders ache before he begins. He leans the cart against a crooked post and lays out the tools in his familiar ritual. The shovel first, then the smaller spade, the cloth, the rope. Each placed with care, not because he believes it necessary, but because habits are the last form of reverence he can afford. The first grave takes the longest. The earth is hard here, packed with stones and the stubborn resistance of a place that has held too much already. He works without hurry. Time moves differently beyond the fence. There is no church bell to mark the hours, no voices to ask when he'll return. His muscles move from memory, digging deeper, shaping the hollow with practiced precision. The sweat trickles down his spine, cold despite the effort, and the scent of wet soil rises like breath. He lowers the bodies one by one, each wrapped in linen, each nameless now. He cannot recall if the last belonged to the man with the limp or the girl who coughed quietly for days before slipping into stillness. It no longer matters. The grave accepts them the same. He speaks no words, though once long ago he used to whisper prayers he barely believed in. Now, he simply presses the dirt back in, layer by layer, smoothing it with the flat of the shovel, pressing it firm. A small stone placed at the head, unmarked, like all the others. When the work is done, he stands at the edge of the mound, the fog swirling faintly around his boots. There is no one to see him, no one to ask why he pauses so long. But he does. He always does. Perhaps, deep inside, there is still some echo of the man he was before the bell tolled daily, before the door markings and the endless digging. A man who once laughed, once cried, once stood among the living. He looks toward the village, barely visible now through the gray. The path curves gently, like a stream cutting through sorrow. The chapel spire peaks above the rooftops, blurred by distance. He will walk it again. He always does. And yet, today, something tugs at his mind, a sense of imbalance, of something left undone. The symbol he saw earlier, drawn in ash upon that final door, lingers in his thoughts. It was not one of mourning, nor of warning. It was something else. A gesture not toward death, but toward invitation, toward something waiting. The gravedigger is not a man given questions, but even he feels a quiet pull of mystery. The consecrated ground ends here, but the story does not. And as he gathers his tools, wiping them clean in the tall grass, he wonders what lies further still, beyond the graves, beyond the fence, beyond even the reach of fog. Because sometimes the true weight of death is not in the digging, but in what it leaves behind. The spade rests now against the cart, its blade streaked with drying earth, its handle worn smooth from years of use. And yet still, the gravedigger does not leave. He stands for a long time at the far edge of the field, looking not at the fresh mound behind him, nor at the mist-veiled path ahead, but into the middle distance where the trees thicken and time itself seems to slow. It is not a place of answers, only questions, of things forgotten, unspoken, or never known. But today, something tugs at him, not with urgency, not even with fear, just a quiet gravity, the kind that pulls from within. Eventually, he turns. The cart creaks into motion once more, wheels reluctant after hours of stillness. The fog is thinned, but only slightly, enough to reveal the spires and rooftops of the village as muted shapes, like charcoal smudges on an old canvas. The chapel bell does not ring. It hasn't in weeks. The priest who once rang it took to his bed one silent evening, and was carried out 2 days later with no ceremony. The tower remains, tall and hollow, like a monument to memory itself. Something built to remind people that they were once capable of hope. He follows a familiar road back, passing the fence again, noting the way the grass has bent from his steps. And then, beyond the bend, past the house with the sun-marked door and the shuttered shop with its shelves of unsold bread, he sees them, the ones who remain. They are not many. A handful, perhaps. A face at a window, too pale to be healthy. A boy sitting on the steps of a house with no roof, carving something into a piece of wood with slow, distracted hands. A woman sweeping dust that will return the moment she turns her back. None of them speak as he passes. Some watch. Most do not. They are not afraid of him. Not anymore. He is not the bringer of death. He is merely its shadow, moving steadily through their world, taking only what has already been lost. There was a time when he would have known their names. Marta, who baked the spring loaves. Tomas, who played the violin when the sun went down. Elric, who once chased crows in the fields with wild laughter. But now, their names live only in his mind, and even there they flicker. The sickness has not taken all of them, not yet, but it has taken more than their health. It has taken their voices, their brightness, their place in the rhythm of the village. They move like ghosts in their own lives, performing motions they no longer believe in, waiting for something they cannot name. The gravedigger pauses near the well. It's dry now, the stones at the bottom cracked and littered with leaves. A bucket lies nearby, broken in two, the rope coiled like a sleeping snake. He remembers when the well was the heart of the village, the place where gossip flowed as freely as water, where children laughed and splashed and mothers warned them to keep clean. Now, it is only a hole in the ground, another absence among many. Across the square, he sees an old man sitting beneath a sagging awning, his hands folded on his lap, his eyes fixed on the horizon. They have exchanged nods before, nothing more. The man speaks to no one, not even when his daughter was buried, not even when the baker's shop burned down in the night. He simply watches, as though expecting something. A sign, a wind, a crack in the sky. And then there are the children, fewer than before and quieter. They do not run or shout. They do not play. They sit in doorways or along the worn fence rails, staring with eyes that seem too large for their thin faces. eyes that have seen too many goodbyes, and too few reasons to smile. The gravedigger meets their gaze and nods once. They nod back, but say nothing. He continues on, past the square, down the slope where the stream once ran clean. It is muddied now, barely a trickle, and the reeds along the banks have begun to wither. He stops at the last house, the one with the ivy creeping over the roof, with the shutters always closed, the chimney cold. It was his once, still is in name, but he no longer sleeps there. The bed is unmade, the hearth untouched. He leaves the cart beside the door and enters. Inside, the quiet is different, thicker, somehow personal. He moves through the single room slowly, brushing dust from the table, lifting a cup, then setting it down again. A loaf of bread lies on the shelf, hard and old. He does not eat it. Instead, he takes a lantern and lights it, not because he needs a light, but because it feels like an act of resistance, a small, flickering defiance against the slow suffocation that has settled over everything. He sits for a while, not thinking, not planning, just sitting. And in that stillness, he becomes aware of something, a presence not seen but felt, a weight in the air, not of death, not quite, but of memory. This house holds echoes, laughter once, voices, the rustle of blankets, the scrape of chairs. All gone now, but not entirely. Not yet. When he rises again, it is with the sense that he must move, not from restlessness, but because stillness, if held too long, becomes something else. It becomes giving up. Outside, the sky has begun to darken, a slow dusk, rolling in like smoke. He walks back toward the chapel, not with urgency, but with intention. There's one more thing to do before the day ends. Because for all those who have passed, and all those who remain, the line between life and memory is growing thinner. And as the night presses in, the village, and those left behind, are learning to live in that space in between. He knows now where he must go next. And so the gravedigger turns, quietly, toward the path that leads out of town, where the last fires have long since burned out. The path that leads away from the village is not one mapped or named. It is not carved in stone or hedged with fences. It does not appear in any of the old records, those worm-eaten ledgers kept in the chapel's archive, or the brittle scrolls once hoarded by the scribes before ink became a thing too precious to waste on memory. And yet, the gravedigger knows it well, not as a road to be followed, but as a presence, a direction, a kind of pull that guides the feet more than the eyes. For this path is unmarked, not because it has no meaning, but because it was never meant for many to walk. It begins behind a row of overgrown hedges, past the blacksmith's ruins, through a break in a low stone wall that once circled the settlement like a protective arm. The wall is half collapsed now, its stones scattered like loose teeth in the tall grass, the mortar weathered and soft. No one mended it. No one tried. Perhaps because it no longer kept anything out, or perhaps because, by the time it fell, there was nothing left to defend. The gravedigger steps over it without thought. His boots know where to fall. This is a part of the countryside that the villagers no longer speak of, not because it is dangerous, though some say it is, but because it belongs to memory, and memory, in days like these, is a burden no one wishes to carry. The fields here once grew wheat, tall and golden, rippling under the breeze like a sea of soft hands. Now they lie empty, the soil cracked and exhausted, the furrows shallow and dry. Crows linger still, though not as many as before. Even the carrion have begun to search elsewhere. The air changes as he walks, not colder, not warmer, just older. It smells of dry leaves and moss, and something sour, like the breath of the forest beyond. This path, though unseen, is lined with forgotten things. A rusted scythe leans against a tree, its blade dull and bent. A child's shoe, missing its pair, lies half buried in the mud. A ribbon, faded to a ghost of red, flutters from a branch. Each object is a breadcrumb in reverse, not leading home, but away from it, deeper into a place where even the birds seem reluctant to sing. He walks slowly, not out of fear, but reverence. There is something sacred in silence, in the way the wind carries no voice, only rustles. The trees here are older than the village, thick-trunked and knotted with time. They lean in close to one another, as though conspiring or perhaps mourning. The gravedigger has walked this path many times before, though never for the same reason. Sometimes to think, sometimes to bury. Once, long ago, simply to run. Today, he walks it because the village no longer holds answers. Because the marked doors have become too familiar. Because the eyes of the living are beginning to weigh more heavily than the silence of the dead. And because he remembers something, not a memory, exactly, but a feeling, a dream from childhood perhaps, or a half-heard tale once whispered by firelight, of a place where the plague did not reach, a place where the dead stayed buried and the living still sang. He does not believe in miracles. Not anymore. But belief is not the only thing that moves a man's feet. Sometimes it is simply the absence of anything else. And so he follows the path, letting it carry him through the woods, past the shallow stream that no longer flows, beneath the arch of limbs that twist together like fingers folded in prayer. The sun has begun to dip behind the hills now, casting the forest in the kind of shadow that moves, not quickly, but with purpose, the kind that slips between trees and settles behind stones, the kind that makes even a rustle of leaves seem like a breath held too long. And yet, the gravedigger does not turn back. He presses forward, his lantern unlit, his hands steady, his steps measured. In the clearing ahead, there is a stump, wide and low, the remnant of a tree that must have once towered over the others. Its surface is carved with symbols, not recent, not crude, but ancient and precise, etched deep in the grain by hands long vanished. He has passed it before and always paused, though he has never touched it. Today he sits, not to rest, but to listen, because in this place, the silence has a different texture. It is not the silence of loss or waiting, but of watching, as though something in the trees, or perhaps in the earth itself, is waiting to be heard. He closes his eyes. The breath moves slower now, deeper. Not sleep, but surrender. And in that stillness, something begins to return, not sound, not quite, but memory or maybe echo. The first time he came here, he was still a boy, chasing a wounded dog through the brush. He found it curled beneath a fallen log, trembling, its eyes wide with pain. He'd sat beside it until the sun set, not speaking, just waiting. It had died in silence, and he had buried it nearby, with a stone for a marker. That stone is gone now. Time has claimed it. But the feeling remains, the sense that this place does not belong to the village, or to the sickness, or even to death. It belongs to something older, something that does not need names. The gravedigger rises. The path continues beyond the stump, narrower now, less traveled, more suggestion than trail. But he knows it goes somewhere. It always has. And as he steps into the deeper woods, past the roots that reach like arms across the soil, he does not feel lost. He feels expected. The forest thickens with every step, and though the fading light above grows weaker by the minute, the path beneath the gravedigger's boots becomes somehow easier to follow, not because it is clearer, but because his feet remember, even if his mind does not. There is a rhythm now in the way he moves, in the soft crunch of old leaves beneath him, in the distant rustle of branches that sway without wind. The forest does not guide with signs or markers, yet it leads all the same, as if some unseen presence is gently tugging him forward by the thread of memory or fate, a path not made by man but by repetition, of steps taken long ago, and of souls who wander this way seeking something more than life among the living. As he walks, the air becomes stiller, heavy not with dread but with that odd reverence that only certain places seem to hold, places that remain untouched not because they are hidden, but because they are remembered only by the land itself. The gravedigger is not sure when he begins to see it, or if it was always just there in the corner of his vision. But soon, through a break in the thick curtain of trees, a shape begins to emerge. Not large, not proud, but solemn and bowed, like a forgotten pilgrim kneeling in the moss. The chapel is small, smaller than he remembered, if indeed he ever truly saw it before. Its walls are stone, low and thick, stained with the dark breath of centuries. Vines curl along its sides like veins on an aging hand, crawling upward into fractured windows that no longer hold glass, but instead frame patches of forest, as though the trees themselves were watching through them. Its roof, once peaked, is sunken in the middle, the timbers beneath warped with damp and rot. No bell hangs in the tower above. if it ever did. Its voice has long since fallen silent. He approaches slowly, reverently. There is no door, or perhaps there once was, and it now lies somewhere among the brambles and ferns that have crept into the threshold like squatters reclaiming a sacred ruin. Stepping inside is like slipping into a memory not his own. The air thicker, quieter, still in a way that presses against the ribs. The floor is stone uneven, with cracks that twist like old scars. In one corner stands a wooden bench, mostly whole but covered in moss, so thick it looks like it grew from the ground itself. There is no altar, no cross, but there is something that holds the space, even if it cannot be seen. A presence, not of godliness, but of grief, ancient grief, worn smooth by time, like a stone rubbed by countless hands. The kind of sorrow that doesn't weep, but simply endures. The gravedigger doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. His steps echo gently as he walks the length of the small chapel, his fingertips grazing the stone wall where faint carvings remain. Symbols worn nearly invisible, their meanings long since forgotten. Circles within circles. Stars that bend at odd angles. A tree with roots reaching downward instead of up. Not holy symbols. Not unholy either. Just human. Perhaps older than the village itself. In the center of the room lies a stone slab, raised slightly, as if to mark a grave or shrine. It is blank, save for a few patches of lichen and the pattern of fallen leaves caught by the draft. He kneels beside it, more out of instinct than devotion, and places a hand upon it. The stone is cold, but beneath the cold, something else, a kind of stillness that feels deep, layered, like a story told without words. He closes his eyes and listens, and in that moment memory comes, not as vision or voice, but as weight, the weight of those buried beyond the fences, of the unnamed, the unblessed, the forgotten. This place is theirs, not as a resting place, but as a remembrance. The chapel, though crumbling and empty, stands as testament to lives that were never recorded. Not saints, not sinners, just people. He opens his eyes slowly, the silence pressing close now, not suffocating, but complete. He rises and looks once more around the room. On the far wall, carved and deep in the rest, is a single line of text, Latin perhaps, or something older. He does not know the words, but their shape is familiar, as though seen once long ago in a dream. He traces the curve of each letter with a callous fingertip, and for a brief moment, the forest outside seems to lean closer, the hush of branches stilling completely. There is no revelation, no great moment of clarity, just the quiet knowledge that this chapel remembers, that it has waited not be discovered, but to be returned to, that the line between sacred and forsaken was never as clear as the world tried to make it, and that even those buried in unmarked graves, in soil denied blessing, still deserved a place to be mourned. He steps outside as dusk deepens into night, and the trees around the chapel seem to bow slightly, their limbs silhouetted against a sky now brushed with stars. He does not light his lantern. He does not need it. For the first time in many weeks, the darkness feels less like a shroud and more like a blanket. Something to carry, not something to fear. And as he makes his way back toward the village, walking slowly, deliberately, he carries with him not answers, but something better. The sense that the forgotten are never truly gone. Not while there is someone to remember. And in the days ahead, as the graves continue to multiply, he knows he will return to the chapel. Not because it offers escape, but because it reminds him of something far older than death. Because when the world has no room left for mourning, sometimes a ruin is enough. The gravedigger's return to the village is not marked by fanfare or greeting, nor by any change of faces that peer silently from behind half-closed shutters or linger near the cold hearts of what were once homes and are now merely shelters from the wind. He arrives without sound, without intention to speak, and the village receives him as it always has, with the gentle indifference of a place too tired to feel surprise. The chapel in the woods, though distant now behind him, remains pressed into his thoughts like a thumbprint in wax. Not memory, but an imprint, still soft and shaping his mind as he walks the familiar path once more. And perhaps it is the quiet gravity of that place, still clinging to him, that makes him notice what he hadn't seen before. The way the graves now stretch further than he remembered. The way of the living had begun to retreat toward the center of the village, as if shrinking beneath the weight of the dead. It is not dramatic. There is no single graveyard, no formal field of stone markers lined like teeth in orderly rows. The burials are spilled outward like spilled ink, along the roadways, in garden plots, near the wells, beneath the trees where children once played. The early ones were given space, care, names, wooden markers carved with shaking hands, small crosses, the remnants of cloth tied around a branch to mark the resting place of someone dearly loved. But those have faded now, their meanings lost as the numbers grew, and the hands that once marked them fell still. He passes the old schoolhouse, now abandoned, the door swinging on a rusted hinge. Its walls are quiet, the chalkboards inside still bearing half-written words that no one finished, lessons interrupted mid-thought, the work of a normal life halted by something no lesson could prepare for. Beside the school is a long, shallow trench, now filled and covered, with a row of stones placed neatly at its head. Not names, just stones. Someone tried, for a while, to keep order, but order, like hope, has a habit of slipping away when it is needed most. In the square, he stands and looks out, eyes tracing the outline of rooftops and alleys, the spaces where laughter used to echo. It is quiet here now, not just with the silence of nightfall, but with the deeper silence that comes when life has ebbed so far that it barely stirs the air. He can count them, if he wishes, the ones who still breathe, who still move with purpose or habit. 24, perhaps a few more, not all seen. Some remain tucked in corners, hiding from the sun, or from the faces of those they used to know. But the graves are everywhere. By the blacksmith's anvil lies a child's shoe, partly buried, beside a mound of earth that was once a flower bed. In the field behind the mill are lines of uneven mounds, some sunken with time, others still fresh, their soil darker and softer, unable yet to forget the touch of hands. Even the churchyard, once considered sacred, has been filled beyond its boundary. Graves now lean against the fence, spill into the road, press against the very walls of the chapel itself as though the dead, in their number, seek the comfort of proximity. There are more graves now than homes, more markers in doorways still open each morning. And with that balance tipped, the village begins to change, not in structure, but in feeling. It is not only quieter, it is heavier. The air itself seems reluctant to move, the wind cautious in its passing, as if it too has learned that to stir too much is to wake something best left sleeping. The gravedigger makes his way to the edge of the field, where the largest of the communal pits had been dug during the worst weeks. It is covered now, marked by a row of stones and a single plank nailed hastily into the ground with no name, only a symbol, a circle with a slash through it, painted in soot. He doesn't remember who painted it. Perhaps it was a healer before she disappeared, or one of the priests who passed through and never returned. It is a symbol without a defined meaning, but it has come to represent something to those who still live, not of the people buried beneath, but of the moment the village gave up trying to keep track. He kneels beside it, fingers brushing over the dry grass, the soil now firm from time and weight. He does not pray, not because he doesn't believe, but because belief has taken on a different shape now, one not of words or rites, but of remembering, of not looking away. From here, he can see the rooftops once more, the chimney smoke that rises from just 3 homes, the soft light of candles behind only a few windows. The dead do not haunt these places. They do not rise, do not whisper, but their presence is undeniable, not in shadows or footsteps, but in the stillness that now defines every morning, in the echoing absence that sits beside every meal, in the way no one walks quickly anymore, as if fearing they'll disturb the ground. He does not weep. The tears were spent months ago, but he sits for a while longer, remembering names he no longer says aloud. The ones buried here were not strangers. They were neighbors, friends, family, and now, in their numbers, they have become the village itself. The ones who built it, who laughed in its taverns and worked in its fields, now lie beneath it, a foundation of sorrow that continues to grow. And as he rises again, the light failing and the air turning colder, he does not feel despair, only a kind of quiet duty. Because even when the graves outnumber the living, Someone must remember. Someone must walk these paths and keep count. Someone must carry the silence. He turns toward the road that leads to the northern ridge, where another row of shallow graves waits for final covering. His lantern swings gently in his grip, unlit but steady. The fog returns as the sun fades, curling around the village like a veil. The sky holds no stars tonight. And so the gravedigger walks, not hurriedly, not solemnly, but with that slow, even step of a man who knows that in a world where death has claimed the louder voices, the only way to honor the fallen is to remain quietly among the living. There is a certain hour in the night, just before the blackest part, when the world seems to hesitate, not in fear nor exhaustion, but in quiet consideration of all it has seen. The wind lessens. The owls grow still. The earth itself seems to draw breath and hold it. It is in this hour that the gravedigger finds himself pausing once more, standing by the edge of an unfinished grave, his spade driven into the soil but untouched since dusk, his eyes fixed not on the task ahead, but on something distant, unseen, buried far deeper than the earth he knows so well. It is not the dead that make his hands tremble on cold nights like this. It is memory, and memory, he has learned, does not decay as swiftly as flesh. There is no proper name for this kind of remembering, the sort that slips in like fog and settles in the bones, heavy and silent, offering no comfort and asking no permission. It is not nostalgia, for there is nothing sweet in it. Nor is it grief, for that suggests an end, a moment when mourning can begin. No, this is something else entirely. A constant presence, like a second skin, the memory of faces, of hands, of laughter, of last words spoken in trembling voices, barely above whispers, always accompanied by eyes that ask not to be left alone. He remembers them all, not just the ones he buried, the ones he couldn't, too. In his small hut at the edge of the village, barely more than a lean-to now, its roof patched with whatever canvas or bark he could scavenge. He keeps things he no longer shows anyone. A torn sleeve from a child's tunic, a spoon carved by someone's father, a bit of braid from a girl who once sang in the square. These are not relics. They are burdens, carried not out of sentimentality, but out of obligation, because someone must remember what was lost, and the weight of that remembering cannot be left to vanish with the wind. Each object tells a story, and the gravedigger hears them whether he wants to or not. The rustle of fabric brings back the sound of the tailor's daughter brushing past him on her way to fetch water, her hair tied up with the same ribbon that now lies tucked in his trunk. The spoon clicks against the others when he cooks, and in that sound is the echo of shared meals in the longhouse, of voices speaking over one another, of the crackle of firelight, and the way it danced in the eyes of people who thought there would always be another winter feast. There wasn't, and yet he cannot let these things go. To bury them would be to forget. To throw them into the fire would be to say they never mattered. And so they remain, small anchors in a world where everything else has drifted away. The worst of it, the part he never speaks aloud, not even to the trees or the wind, is the memory of those he did not bury. The ones who died alone behind locked doors, their bodies discovered too late or not at all. He remembers the smell that first clued him in, the way the birds circled, the silence that settled over a house like a shroud before he ever crossed its threshold. He remembers walking in alone to find them, stiff, wide-eyed, hands frozen mid-reach or clasped in prayer. He remembers every face, not because he tried to, but because they gave him no choice. He dreams of them sometimes, not as ghosts, not as horrors, but as they were in those final moments, caught between fear and fatigue, each frozen in a last posture of pleading or resignation. And always, in those dreams, they look at him as if waiting, as if expecting him to say something, to explain. But there is no explanation. There never was. The plague did not arrive with fanfare or logic. It came like fog over the hills, unnoticed until it pressed its damp fingers against every window pane. It did not choose. It did not bargain. It did not answer prayers. It simply took, and left behind the cold weight of memory to those who remained. He moves now, slowly, toward the hearth in his little shelter. The fire has long since died, leaving only coals that glow faintly beneath the ash. He does not stir them. The cold suits the night, matches the quiet that has grown thick in his chest. He sits with his back against the wall, the sound of forest pressing gently against the timbers, not threatening, not hostile, just present, as if the world beyond still watches him, still waits to see what he will do next. And in the stillness, he allows himself to remember not just the dead, but the before, the way the village used to sound at midday, the calls from the market stalls, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lazy cluck of hens wandering between gardens. He remembers the song the baker used to hum while kneading dough, the way the children raced down the hill, chasing a wooden hoop, the smell of bread, the sound of laughter. These memories are cruel in their clarity. They arrive sharp and vivid, unwelcome in their insistence. And yet he clings to them, because, while the weight of memory is heavy, it is also the only thing he has left of the world as it was, the only proof that it existed at all. Outside, a crow calls once. Then again, it is answered by another, somewhere deep in the trees. The gravedigger listens, but does not move. The cold has settled in his bones now, not painful, but deep, as if memory itself has seeped into his marrow and decided to stay. And as he closes his eyes, not to sleep, but to rest, he wonders if perhaps this is what the dead feel. Not silence, not peace, but the constant echo of what once was. The clatter of spoons, the laughter of children, the soft sound of ribbon falling to the floor. But unlike the dead, he must rise again in the morning, because there will be another grave, and the past, no matter how heavy, must be carried forward. The smokehouse stood at the far edge of the village, past a well-worn track that ran beside the stream, half shrouded by elderberry bushes, and leaning so precariously to one side that it seemed only the vines clinging to its frame kept upright. It had once been a place of warmth and preparation, where the thick scent of oak and hickory mingled with the fat and salt of curing meat, a sanctuary of abundance in a world that otherwise measured the passing of time by hunger. But now, like so many of the buildings that remained, it held not the memory of food, but of absence, an emptiness that echoed more loudly than any voice could. The gravedigger approached it without urgency. There were no more animals to slaughter, no more brine-soaked slabs to hang from its rafters. Yet he came here often, drawn not by reason, but by something quieter, a whisper of familiarity, a pull toward what once meant preparation and preservation, both words that had now become abstract, nearly irrelevant in a place where the dead outnumbered the living, and preservation was a fantasy left to the realm of dry books and forgotten rituals. The wooden door creaked as he opened it, the hinges groaning in protest, as though reluctant to admit even him. Inside, the air was still, faintly damp but not rotten. Smoke no longer clung to the walls, yet the memory of it remained, embedded in the beams, in the stones of the hearth, in the iron hooks overhead that still swayed slightly in the occasional breath of air that found its way through the broken slats. He ducked his head as he entered, not because the ceiling was low, but out of habit, the instinctive nod of a man returning to a space where labor was once sacred. It was in this smokehouse. He remembered that the last feast had been prepared, not a feast in the grand sense. No music, no garlands, no guests from distant towns. Just the villagers, gathered in anticipation of the cold months, working side by side, the butcher cleaving slabs of meat with practiced precision, the weaver's wife rubbing salt into the flesh with callous hands, the children running in and out, stealing scraps when they thought no one was looking. There had been laughter then, rough and unrefined, and the warm camaraderie of people bound by necessity more than affection, though both had existed in strange proportions. Now, only silence remained. And yet, as he stood in the center of the room, the gravedigger could almost hear it again, faint and flickering, like an echo trapped in the wood. Not word exactly, but fragments of them, broken syllables that brushed past his ear like wind through tall grass. He did not startle. These were not ghosts in the way old stories told of them. These were memories breathed back into being by the familiarity of place, by the alignment of quiet light and the shape of his own breath in the cold air. He reached for a stool in the corner, one leg shorter than the others, wobbling slightly, and lowered himself onto it with a quiet groan. His hands, worn and ridged like bark, rested on his knees. Around him, the air felt thick but not heavy. It was as though the room had been waiting for someone to remember it, not to clean it, not to restore it, but simply to sit and listen. He did, and in the listening he recalled. He remembered the old man who had tended the smokehouse. Garrett, his name was, broad-shouldered and near silent, save for the occasional muttered curse when the fire refused to catch or the salt ran low. Garrett had taught him, once, how to judge when the meat was ready. "It's in the sound," he'd said, tapping a slab with the back of his knuckle. "A hollow thumb means you're done." Garrett had died in the third wave of sickness, his body discovered leaning against the outside wall, as though even in death he had refused to leave his post. He remembered, too, the boy, barely 12, who had taken over after Garrett fell. The boy had lasted 6 days before he vanished into the woods, never to return. Some said he'd gone mad from hunger. Others whispered of darker things, that he'd seen the dead move, that the smokehouse itself whispered to him things no child should hear. But the gravedigger had never believed that. The boy had simply run. Because sometimes running, even into the unknown, feels safer than waiting for the known to take you. In the rafters above him, the iron hooks creaked again, and his eyes followed them, tracing the lines of the beams, the joins in the roof, the way the fading light filtered through the spaces between the planks. Dust motes danced there, slowly, as though even they had learned to move with caution in this place. And then the whispers came again, clearer this time, but still not voices, more like the rustling of pages, or the turning of leaves, or the distant echo of a chant half-remembered from childhood. It was a sound of memory finding its shape, of forgotten moments pulling themselves upright from the heap of time. He heard his own name spoken not by any present tongue, but by the soft lilt of someone who had once known it well. He could not say who. The voice was unanchored, not from the living or the dead, but from that space between, the one that the smokehouse now seemed to occupy. And it occurred to him then, slowly and without fear, that the smokehouse had never stopped preserving. Not food, but stories, moments, pieces of life. It had held on to them, trapped them in wood and smoke and iron and silence. And now, with the world outside so hollowed by death, it released them again, not as warnings, but as reminders that once people had lived here, had worked, had laughed, had prepared for winters that they thought would always come and go. He sat for a long time after the whispers faded, eyes closed, breathing slowly, not weeping, not praying, just remembering, letting the weight of those small, lost moments settle around him like ash. When he finally rose, the shadows had deepened and the forest outside had begun to stir again with the cautious sounds of night. He left the smokehouse as gently as he had entered, pulling the door closed behind him with the care one might use to cover a grave. And as he stepped back onto the path, the cold pressing against his face once more, he felt no fear, no burden heavier than before. Only the strange, quiet comfort of knowing that not all had been lost, that some things, held in silence and shadow, had endured. And somewhere ahead, waiting in the frost-covered world beyond the smokehouse, the next story still whispered its way toward him. As the path from the smokehouse narrowed into a thicket of saplings that had grown wild without the tending hands of villagers, the gravedigger stepped carefully, the frost beneath his boots crackling in the hush of early morning. There was no destination in mind, no duty pressing him forward, only the quiet tug of instinct, that soft inner voice that pulls a man toward places not because they are needed, but because they remember. And what they remember, more often than not, is sorrow. It was in this way that he found himself drawn to the schoolyard, or what was left of it, where the frost curled around broken benches, and the faint outlines of letters still lingered on a weathered slate. The schoolhouse had once stood with pride at the edge of the village green, its bell tower crooked even in better days, its roof patched more with hope than with timber. And yet it had been the heart of something gentle, a place where stories were told, where small fingers struggled with chalk, and where laughter had been the surest sign that life had not yet surrendered. That laughter was gone now, replaced by the stiff creak of broken hinges and the low moan of wind that slipped between splintered shutters. But it was not the building he had come for. It was what lay beneath, the memory of children. They had been the first to vanish, without warning. Not the first to die, but the first to be missed in a way that broke something inside the village. The elders were mourned, the sick were grieved, but when the children began to fall silent, something else began to decay. Not the body, but the spirit of the place. It was as if the very soil, recognizing the absence of small feet and high voices, began to harden in protest. The gravedigger stood beside what had once been a garden, now a patch of earth marked not with flowers, but with tiny mounds, graves no bigger than a cradle, some with stones, others with nothing at all. A small shoe peeked from beneath a thin layer of dirt, half swallowed by time. He did not move it. He never did. These places were sacred in a way the grand tombs of nobles could never be. Here, memory sat like frost on every surface, quiet and unmelting, and even the birds avoided flying overhead, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. He remembered their names, not all of them, but many. Alric, the boy who would race the wind along the lane behind the blacksmith shop. Mira, who sang to the goats and tied scraps of cloth to the fence posts as if decorating a festival. Halden, whose voice cracked with excitement every time he recited a tale he thought the others hadn't heard yet. Small lives, bright and unfinished. Each one now a marker in his mind, etched not in marble, but in the shape of the empty spaces they left behind. They had tried, in the early days, to shield the children from the worst of it. The school had remained open longer than most buildings. Even as fear grew, lessons continued by candlelight, hands washed obsessively, prayers whispered between lines of copied script. But disease is not repelled by ink or intention, and one by one they began to fall ill. A fever here, a cough there, then silence. The school closed without a ceremony, without goodbyes. It simply stopped, and its doors remained shut ever since. And yet the children lingered, not in the ghostly sense, not as shadows darting between trees or faces glimpsed in the mist, but in the way time freezes when a life is cut short. They remained in stories unfinished, in toys left beside hearths, in the half-painted images on walls that no one dared wash away. Their absence was a presence all its own, loud in its quiet, sharp in its stillness. And for those who remained, it was a weight too heavy to carry and too sacred to set down. He recalled a moment, vivid, sudden, cruel in its clarity, of finding a small wooden doll lying on a doorstep, its arms missing, its paint faded but still smiling. He remembered picking it up, turning it in his hands, and realizing that he could not remember which child had owned it. And in that moment, the true horror of the plague came clear. Not the dying, but the forgetting, the slow erasure of names, of faces, of songs and voices that had once defined a place. The children, he knew, had not feared death in the way adults did. They had feared being left alone, the cold touch of fever, the silence that replaced familiar voices. They had feared the stillness. And now, in turn, the village feared their memory, not because it haunted, but because it reminded. He knelt beside one of the smallest mounds, hands resting on his knees, eyes lowered not in prayer, but in respect. There was no stone, no name, only a tuft of grass that had grown in defiance of the frost. He brushed it gently with the back of his hand. No words came. There were none sufficient. Only the soft rhythm of breath and the memory of lullabies long since fallen silent. As he stood, the first light of morning began to stretch thin fingers across the trees, pale and golden, touching the tops of the gravestones, as if counting them, as if checking to see who remained. The world, in its slow turning, had not forgotten these places. Nature, at least, still passed through them with gentleness, and the gravedigger, carrying the quiet burden of those small lives in his chest, began to walk again. The road ahead led toward the high ridge, a place where the village once celebrated solstices and watched the stars. It was a path rarely taken now, overgrown and steep, but the children had gone there once, lanterns in hand, laughter trailing like ribbons in the wind. And perhaps, he thought, their echoes still lingered in the grasses, waiting to be heard. He followed the path not to mourn, but to remember, and in that remembering, to keep something of them alive, not just in memory, but in movement, in breath, in the continued act of walking through a world they had once filled with light. And in the hush of that climb, with the earth still cold beneath his feet and the sun reluctant to rise, the gravedigger felt once more the weight of those young lives, not as sorrow, but as purpose. By the time the gravedigger reached the ridge, the sun had begun its slow crawl across the pale horizon, painting the treetops with the faintest warmth, though not enough to melt the frost that clung to the stones like forgotten prayers. The hill, though not high by any measure of mountains or legends, offered a view that made the world feel broader, yet smaller all at once. A patchwork of fields now brown and abandoned, cottages that sat like slumped shoulders against the weight of sky. And in the middle distance, just beyond the trees that marked the edge of the forest, the bell tower of the chapel, crooked now and hollow, but still standing, a silent witness to all that had passed below it. It was toward that chapel he turned next, his steps slow, not out of weariness, but reverence, for the road that led to was no ordinary track. It was a path of the faithful, the once well-trodden route worn smooth by generations of feet that had carried offerings, sorrow, and song to a place where hope had once been spoken aloud. Now the path was cracked with roots and strewn with dry leaves, the altar long silent. The pews collapsed inward like ribs of a long-dead beast, and the air inside stale with the scent of mildew and dust. And yet, for the gravedigger, this place remained sacred, not because it promised salvation, but because it still echoed with the soft murmurs of those who had once believed. When the Black Death came, it did not spare the holy. The plague, indifferent as stone, cared little for robes or prayers, passing through the cloisters with the same cruel efficiency it visited upon the baker's cottage or the shepherd's hut. One by one, the priests had fallen, some while tending the sick, others while speaking their last rites with shaking hands, their incense blending with the stench of rot in the air. And still, the villagers came, their hunger not only for food, but for something greater, for reassurance, for answers, for some tether to meaning amid the unraveling of everything they had known. The gravedigger remembered standing at the back of the chapel, unnoticed among the gathered, the smell of earth clinging to his cloak, watching the priest, Father Edric, kneel before the altar long after prayers had ended. The man had aged in weeks, his hands no longer steady, his voice trembling beneath the weight of desperation, and the people, already hollowed by hunger, watched him not for guidance, but for signs. Any flicker that heaven still listened, that the old promises of mercy and protection had not all been lies whispered through stained glass. But when the food ran out, the candles dwindled, and the choir stopped singing, even the most faithful found themselves questioning what faith could offer in the face of such relentless decay. The gravedigger saw in their eyes, not anger, not rebellion, but something worse, resignation. They no longer prayed for healing. They prayed for swift ends, for painless farewells, for the silence to come sooner rather than later. He stepped inside the chapel now, careful not to disturb the brittle remains of the once ornate door. Inside, the air was thick with cold and time. The crucifix still hung, askew, from a beam overhead. The Christ figure weathered by moisture, his face eroded until it seemed more like a mask of sorrow than a symbol of salvation. The altar cloth, stained and moth-eaten, lay draped like a forgotten robe over the stone slab, and beneath it, the chalice sat untouched, its silver tarnished, but still reflecting slivers of light. He walked down the aisle, boots brushing against the rubble of collapsed benches, his shadow dancing on the faded walls where murals of saints had once glowed with gold and cobalt. Here and there, offerings remained, a wooden rosary, a child's drawing, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, desperate tokens from desperate hands, left behind not in hope of miracles, but as last gestures of connection to something larger, something unseen. And the gravedigger, who had dug graves for both sinner and saint, knew better than most that in the end, belief offered no immunity, only comfort, and even that was fleeting. There had been a time, he recalled, when the starving had gathered here not to pray, but to beg, not for salvation, but for bread. The chapel store had been meager, its cellars intended only for sacramental wine and simple loaves. But when the fields failed and the animals died and the roads became death routes rather than trade paths, the people came here, mouths open, hands trembling, bellies distended from days without sustenance. The faithful had become the famished, and the sanctuary a place of rationed pity. The priest had done what he could. He gave everything, even his own meals, thinning broth until it became more ritual than nourishment. But when his body gave out, collapsed beneath the altar one bitter morning, the faithful lost their last tether to the divine. There was no second priest. No miracle came, and those who had gathered here began to scatter, some into the woods, some to neighboring villages already lost to sickness, and some simply into their homes, where they waited for hunger to finish what disease had not. The gravedigger sat on the floor now, knees bent back against a cold column. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the air around him. It was heavier here, thicker with memory. And in the silence, he imagined the sound of footsteps, slow, shuffling, desperate, and the echo of prayers mumbled through cracked lips. The prayers of those who had once believed that suffering had purpose, that loss could be balanced with redemption, that the divine would intervene before bones became brittle and breath stopped. But no intervention came, and so he opened his eyes and stared at the altar, not with bitterness, but with understanding. The church had not failed them. The faith had not lied. It had simply been too small to hold the vastness of their suffering. Like trying to catch floodwaters with a single cup, he rose again, his knees stiff, joints aching. The chapel had given all it could, and now it too was fading into the silence. But the memory of the faithful, of their hunger, their whispered hymns, their trembling hands, remained. And as he stepped back out into the cold air, letting the broken door creak shut behind him, the gravedigger carried that memory with him, tucked beneath the layers of his worn cloak, not as a weight, but as a thread, one of many, in the long, unraveling tapestry of a world stitched together by the ones who endured. Ahead, the wind rustled through the trees, guiding him back toward the village's edge. And somewhere near the abandoned mill, he knew the next task awaited. Not a grave this time, but something older, darker, buried not in the soil, but in silence. The path wound low again, dropping gently from a hilltop chapel and curling along the tree-line, where the trees grew less dense in the air, though bitter with the season's bite, seemed to carry a different weight. Not heavier, but quieter, like a pause held too long in a dying conversation. The gravedigger followed it as one might follow a memory, not driven by urgency or obligation, but by a kind of solemn gravity, as though his body remembered the route even if his mind had not set out with intention. He passed dry creeks and splintered cartwheels, moss-covered stones that once lined fences now long since collapsed, and finally reached a clearing where the village mill had once stood proud and humming, its water wheel frozen in the grip of time, its great stone belly now silent, its teeth no longer grinding. The mill was a place once alive with motion, with rhythm, with purpose. The steady turning of wood and stone, the creak of ropes, the clatter of sacks being hoisted, the muted grunt of labor exchanged in lieu of conversation, and always a sound of grain becoming flour, that soft grinding like a heartbeat beneath the village's daily noise. But now, no smoke rose from its chimney, no sacks lined its threshold, and the wheel, once pushed by a playful, winding stream, sat motionless beside dry banks, the water long since diverted or swallowed by the thirsty earth. He crossed the threshold without needing to knock. There was no one left to answer. Inside, the cold was sharp and unmoving, as if time itself had paused in here, unwilling to disturb the stillness that had settled like dust on every beam and barrel. The walls were dark with soot and wear, the air thick with the faint, metallic scent of rusting machinery and dry grain husks that had been scattered and never gathered again. It was not abandonment that haunted the mill, it was interruption. Everything had been left mid-motion, as though the workers had only stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. He moved slowly, boots whispering across the powdery floor, his fingers trailing along the edge of the central hopper, where flour had once spilled like snowfall onto waiting cloth. A memory stirred, not vivid, but persistent, of the last time the millstone had turned. It had been near dusk, late in the season, and the miller's apprentice, a boy with arms too thin for the job, had struggled to keep pace with the demand. The grain, such as it was, had been meager, coarse, and riddled with signs of spoil, but still they had milled, clinging to the ritual, the familiar sound, as though the rhythm itself might keep death at bay. But hunger cannot be milled away, nor can the silence that follows it. The villagers had brought what little grain they had left, their offerings pale and pitiful. They stood in line with hollow cheeks and quiet eyes, exchanging murmurs rather than pleasantries, watching the miller's hands work with mechanical insistence. Flour was measured in handfuls, not sacks. The end was near and all knew it. Still, they came, not for sustenance, but for the comfort routine, the belief that as long as the wheel turned, The world had not yet unraveled completely, and then one day it stopped. No warning, no ceremony. The stream ran dry or clogged or fled. No one knew for sure, and the wheel slowed, then ceased. The boy vanished days later. Some said he wandered into the woods. Others whispered that he'd simply laid down beside the stone, letting his hunger lull him into stillness. The miller, too, was found not long after, slumped beside his ledger, his last entry unfinished. And so the mill was sealed, not by boards or locks, but by silence, left to sit in the same half-breath that it exhaled in its final moment of usefulness. The gravedigger stood beside the great wheel now, placing a hand on the cracked wood. It was rough and dry beneath his fingers, but it held memory. Not sound, but shape, the grooves of years of use, the indentations where ropes had rubbed and palms had pushed. He leaned in, pressing his ear against it, as if listening for something. But there was only quiet, not empty quiet, but the kind that holds stories like a bowl holds water. Heavy, waiting, full. He sat near the base of the millstone, not to rest, but to remember, drawing his cloak tighter around his shoulders. The silence here was different than that of the chapel. There, it had been a hush of unanswered prayers. Here, it was a stillness of halted purpose. The silence that comes not from neglect, but from exhaustion. The kind of silence that does not cry out be broken, but simply exists vast and undemanding, like the blank space between stars. There had been children, once, who played here while their parents worked. They had scattered grain like confetti and drawn patterns in spilled flour. Their laughter carried in the wind like birdsong. He remembered one, in particular, a girl with two mismatched shoes and a tendency to hum tuneless melodies as she skipped between sacks. She had vanished early in the plague, her absence marked only by the quietness that replaced her noise. Her name escaped him now, that forgetting hurt more than any grave he had dug. The gravedigger rose slowly, knees protesting, and glanced around once more. The mill had fed them, employed them, ordered their days with its sound and motion. Its silence now marked more than the absence of grain. It marked the fracture of rhythm, the end of predictable cycles. Where once people came and left with purpose, now there was only stillness, and the echoes of hands that no longer toiled. He walked out into the fading day. The sky above now a soft, muted gray, the kind of light that casts no shadows and promises no warmth. The village behind him, the chapel behind that, and somewhere ahead, a different kind of memory waited. Not one of bread or prayer, but of justice, of fear, and the kind of judgment that weighed not only deeds, but silence itself. For beyond the mill, beyond the field where no wheat would grow again, sat the overgrown path that led to the magistrate house, a place where once decisions had been made, where justice had been read from books and spoken with gravitas, and where, in the days of sickness, silence had also become a verdict. The path that led from the mill to the magistrate's house was not marked on any map, for no maps were kept anymore, and even if they were, they would not have shown such a quiet, crumbling trail, one hidden beneath layers of wet leaves, half swallowed by moss and memory, and flanked by hedgerows so overgrown they leaned inward like old men bent by sorrow, whispering to each other in a language no longer spoken. The gravedigger followed this trail slowly, not out of hesitation, but from an almost ritualistic respect, as if he were entering not just a different part of the village, but another realm entirely, a place where power had once lived, cloaked in velvet and legality, yet now lay reduced a little more than a sagging roof and cold hearthstones. The magistrate's house had once stood as a proud structure, tall but modest, with heavy wooden beams and arched windows that gazed down upon the village square like judging eyes. Its doorway had been wide, its knocker shaped like a lion's head, and its hall lined with scrolls, ledgers, and the scent of dried ink and stiff leather. It was a place where disputes had been settled, where land had been claimed or denied, and where the fragile web of order had been spun with careful fingers. But now, as the gravedigger approached, the house appeared less like a seat of justice and more like a mausoleum, its shutters hanging crooked, its door ajar, and ivy climbing up its stone walls like silent accusations that had never been answered. He stepped through the doorway without knocking. There was no one left to knock for. Inside, the air was colder than outside, as though the walls had trapped the chill and fed on it, turning it into something deeper. Not just a lack of warmth, but a presence of absence. The furniture remained, though sagging and dust-covered, and the magistrate's great desk still dominated the center of the main chamber, its surface piled with curling parchment, ink pots dry and crusted, a single quill resting like a feather lost in midair. Behind the desk stood the tall-backed chair, empty, worn smooth at the arms where fingers had once gripped with authority. The gravedigger stood in the doorway of the room for a long moment, eyes tracing the pattern of dust motes that drifted lazily in the shafts of weak light coming through the broken windows. There was a silence here that was not peaceful. It pressed against the ears, not gently like snowfall, but heavily, like a hell breath. The silence of judgment delayed, of decisions never made, of justice never delivered. He had not known the magistrate well, for the two men had occupied different orbits in the village's order. The magistrate ruled with words and writs, while the gravedigger worked in the soil, where the language was quieter and more final. But he had seen the man many times, tall, narrow-faced, always dressed in dark wool. His voice careful and measured, never rising in volume, but always commanding attention. He had seemed a man above panic, one who believed in the weight of law even as the world around him began to slip into something more primitive, more desperate. And yet, when the plague came, even that calm had been shaken. The gravedigger remembered the first time someone brought a case before the magistrate not of property or insult, but of infection. A neighbor accused another of hiding a sick relative, of endangering the village, of violating the unspoken code of fear that had begun to shape every choice. The magistrate had listened, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable, and then he had said nothing. He had issued no verdict. He had offered no punishment. He had simply sent them away. That was when the silence began. Case after case came, not of theft or violence, but survival. Disputes over grain hoarded, wells guarded, borders crossed. Each time, the magistrate listened, and each time he said nothing. He wrote nothing. The ledgers remained blank, the ink undisturbed. It was as though he believed that by refusing to acknowledge the unraveling, he might somehow prevent it, that justice, like disease, could be kept at bay if not spoken aloud. But silence in a time of fear becomes its own kind of judgment. The gravedigger stepped further into the room, his fingers brushing the edge of the desk. He picked up a parchment at random, the ink faded, the script uneven. It was a list of names, some crossed out, some underlined. No notes of what crimes were committed, if any, just names, like gravestones without epitaphs. He set it down again, his breath visible in the cold air. The magistrate, he had heard, died not long after the last bell tolled. No one found him at first. It was only when the smell began to seep from beneath the door that anyone dared to enter. And there he was, slumped in the very chair before him, a goblet in hand, lips stained dark. No wound, no struggle, just a quiet, final choice, the silence of a man who could no longer bear the weight of inaction. The villagers did not mourn him. They did not bury him with honor. They did not curse him either. They simply stopped speaking of him, as though silence were contagious. His house remained untouched, not out of reverence, but out of discomfort. A reminder of what happens when those entrusted with guidance choose to look away. The gravedigger stood now by the window, staring out at the overgrown yard where the magistrate's herb garden had once thrived. The plants had choked themselves out, growing wild and tangled, lavender mixing with yarrow, mint overtaken by thistle. Even the plants had stopped following rules. Even nature had gone quiet in protest. He left the house with slow steps, pausing at the threshold to glance once more at the empty chair. The silence followed him, clinging to his cloak, settling into the creases of his gloves. It was not the kind of silence that begged to be broken. It was the kind that filled a space so completely that nothing else could live there. As he stepped back into the dying light, the wind picked up colder now, carrying the distant creak of the empty gallows at the far edge of the village, a place where once justice had spoken in rope and wood. That was where he would go next, not to remember a verdict, but to remember what silence had allowed to take its place. He moved now through the last quarter of the village, where the houses grew farther apart and the trees crept in closer, as though nature itself was reclaiming the land one root at a time, wrapping broken beams in ivy and splitting cobbled paths with slow, patient fingers of moss. The ground here sloped gently upward, not steeply, but enough that the walk became a kind of climb, one that made the knees ache slightly and force a breath into longer, deeper pulls. He walked without hurry, boots crunching the scattered gravel of a road once carefully maintained, now pitted and laced with puddles that reflected only a gray and formless sky. The wind had returned too, just slightly, teasing the folds of his cloak and carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Not fresh smoke from fire, but the old, stale echo of burned wood and charred memories clinging still to the earth after all these years. At the top of the rise, the trees parted suddenly, and there it stood, the gallows. It had been built long before the plague, before the famine, before the last harvest failed, back when the village still held markets and fairs, and once a year, a procession of judges in red robes would arrive from the city to remind everyone that justice was not only local, but national, and that those who transgress the laws of crown and cross could expect judgment to come swiftly and very publicly. The gallows had not been used often. A thief here, a murderer there, but it always loomed in the village's consciousness like a shadow that never moved, a silent promise of consequences in a world where most things went unnoticed. Children had feared it. Adults had avoided speaking of it. And now, it was just a skeleton of timber, grayed by weather, creaking softly when the wind moved through its beams, its rope long gone, though the hook at the top still hung like an unanswered question. The gravedigger stood before it, hands tucked inside his sleeves, gaze slowly tracing the contours of the platform, the ladder, the post. Time had not been kind to it, but nor had time erased it. And that, perhaps, was the most telling thing of all, that even as the fields withered, the people vanished, the churches emptied, and the houses collapsed on themselves, the gallows had endured. No one had dismantled it. No one had burned it down or used its wood for kindling. It had simply been left there untouched, as if the village feared that taking it down might invite something worse. He remembered, dimly, the last execution. Not the crime, not the name, but the sound. The crowd had gathered in silence, pressed shoulder to shoulder, no murmurs, no jeers, no weeping, just a shuffle of feet on packed dirt and the rustle of cloaks in the wind. The condemned had said nothing. The priest had muttered the rites with a voice like falling ash. And when the trapdoor dropped, it was not the crack of neck that echoed loudest, but the sharp gasp of the crowd, that communal intake of breath that seemed less like shock and more like surrender. That had been before the sickness, before the hunger, before silence settled over the village like a second skin. After that, no more sentences were passed. No more hangings held, but the gallows remained. The gravedigger stepped slowly onto the platform now, boots thudding dully on the aged boards, and stood where the condemned one stood, though there was no noose above him now. Only sky, blank and pale, without sun or promise. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to imagine the final moment of those who had stood here, but to feel the weight of place, the memory embedded in wood and stone and earth. Not everything was recorded in books. Some histories lived only in the ground and in the quiet spaces between remembered names. The fog was rising now, curling around the base of the platform like slow-moving ghosts, blurring the edge of the trees and swallowing the road below. The gallows, already silent, now seemed lost in dream, suspended not in time, but in something older and more indifferent. It did not care who had built it, who had died here, or who still remembered. It simply stood. And yet, for all its stillness, it spoke. Not in words, of course, but in presence, in the way it had outlived the law it once served, the crowd that once gathered, and even a man who passed the judgments. In a village consumed by plague, emptied by famine and silenced by fear, the gallows was not justice. It was a reminder that when fear grows large enough, it no longer needs rules, that when silence is long enough, even the memory of defiance becomes dangerous. The gravedigger stepped down again, slowly, 1 foot at a time, careful not to disturb the structure more than necessary. He walked to the edge of the clearing and turned back to look at it once more, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with recognition. The gallows was not the past. It was the present, stretched thin. It was the echo of decisions unspoken, of laws unchallenged, of eyes turned downward while the rope was tied. And from here, with the fog thickening behind him and the wind shifting once more, he turned toward a road that led beyond the village limits. Not far, just over the next ridge, where the land sloped into the valley and the ruins of an old monastery waited. That was where he would go next, not for prayer, but because it was there that the sick had once been taken when there was no room left in homes, no comfort left in churches, and no mercy left in men. He walked slowly, steadily, the gallows shrinking behind him with each step until it became a shape lost in mist, and then not even a shape, just another part of the silence. Down the ridge he walked, the fog falling behind him like a closing curtain, the wooden bones of the gallows disappearing into grayness and memory, until even the thought of it seemed like something that might have been dreamt rather than seen. And before him now, the land dropped gently into a hollow of stone and shadow where the trees grew thinner and the soil gave way to scattered slate and patches of low, stubborn grass. The road became less a road and more a suggestion, a pattern worn faint in the earth by the weight of old footsteps that no longer fell. And there, half veiled by creeping vines and a crumbling outer wall, stood the monastery. It was not grand, not like the cathedrals of the cities, nor the fortified abbeys of wealthier regions, but had once held dignity, a quiet sort, shaped not by gold or glass, but by the slow devotion of men who had chosen silence as their armor and solitude as their offering. The gravedigger paused before its broken gate, one hinge hanging useless, the other crusted with rust, and he looked up at the old stone arch above the entrance. Weathered now, the inscription so faded it might as well have been wind, but still, he knew what it once read: Ora et labora, pray and work. A commandment and a promise, both abandoned. He stepped through. Inside, the cloister had been overtaken by nature. Weeds pushed up the flagstones, ivy climbed the inner columns, and birds nested in the once sacred spaces between broken window panes and sagging eaves. The silence here was not unnatural. It was deep-rooted, as though it had been part of the place even when voices had filled it, when chants had echoed beneath its vaulted ceilings, and the bells had rung with the rhythm of hours passed in humility. Now, there were no voices, no chants, no bells, only the wind, threading itself through the broken timbers, and the sound of his own feet moving gently forward, careful not to disturb what had already been forgotten. He passed the refectory first, where wooden tables still stretched in ghostly rows, the benches long since warped by rain and time. A few wooden bowls remained, cracked and dry, as though the monks had simply risen one morning and not returned. And perhaps in truth they hadn't. When the sickness came, the monastery had taken in the dying. That much the gravedigger remembered. Not just the villagers, but wanderers, beggars, even those cast out by their own families. The brothers had opened their doors and laid down their own cloaks to line the cold stone floors. They had prayed over the dying. They had washed their faces. They had sung the psalms, even as their own hands began to tremble and their own skin turned pale. Some said it had been an act of holy mercy. Others said it was foolishness, that they should have barred the gates and preserved themselves. But the monks had believed in salvation, in charity, in sacrifice. And so they opened their doors until death walked freely in and took up residence in the cells and the cloisters and the chapel. And one by one, the brothers stopped singing. He stepped into the chapel last. It was the heart of the monastery, and though its roof had partly caved and its altar stood cracked in two, there was something here that had not entirely left. Not holiness, perhaps, but memory. Rows of wooden pews still stood, many broken, some intact. The great cross above the altar had fallen, but leaned now against the rear wall, worn smooth by weather and the occasional hand that reached out in instinct or desperation. The gravedigger stood in the center aisle, eyes lifted to the remnants of painted glass in the apse, where once saints had glowed in colored light. Now reduced to shards, their faces lost, their halos shattered, yet still, when the sun caught them just so, a flicker of color danced across the stone floor like a ghost of devotion. He had been here once before, not as a mourner, not to bury, but to carry. In the height of the plague, when the village ran out of space and graves, the die had been brought here and laid side by side in the chapel, their bodies arranged not by name or family, but by who could still breathe and who had ceased to. He remembered the silence, not peaceful but strained, broken only by the coughing, the whispered prayers, and the final, fragile breath that always sounded more like a sigh than a scream. The brothers had died one by one, until none remained. And then the monastery closed itself, not with locks, but with decay. He walked slowly down the aisle now, hands at his sides, boots soft against the dust-covered stones. He passed a few scattered items. A rosary, a wooden spoon, a page of parchment fused to floor by time and damp. No one came here anymore. Not to pray, not to remember. But in this silence, there was something more powerful than memory. There was witness. The walls bore it. The air held it. Even the shadows seemed to lean forward slightly, as though listening. Still, he knelt at the edge of the chancel, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement, a gesture not to the divine, but to those who had chosen mercy over survival, who had welcomed the dying when no one else would. Theirs had not been a failure. It had been a decision, one that cost him everything, but left behind something no rot or ruin could quite erase. And as he rose again and stepped back into the cloister's ruins, the wind shifted once more, colder now, carried with the scent of distant wood smoke. Real this time, not memory, and he turned toward it, following the direction it came from, knowing what lay beyond. For past the monastery's broken gate and the edge of the hill, there was another place, not sacred, not noble, but necessary. A field not wide, but deep, where the bodies had been taken when there was no more space, no more coffins, and no more names. A trench, long covered now by grass and root, but not forgotten. It was time to return there. He moved quietly now, the weight of memory pressing gently but undeniably into space between his shoulders as he left the monastery's crumbling walls behind, its chapel slowly vanishing into haze of distance and vine, and ahead of him stretched a low, narrow trail, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, a winding cut through tufts of grass and the occasional shattered stone, lined faintly with the tracks of old carts long since turned to dust, and framed on either side by thistles and the occasional crooked fence post that marked nothing in particular, merely the boundaries of grief no longer respected by lines or logic. The land here sloped down into a shallow valley, quiet and windless, as though even the air decided to hold its breath, and as he descended he felt again that subtle, almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere, the feeling of walking not just through space, but across a threshold, one that led not into a place of rest, but into memory of desperation itself. There were no signs, no markers, no wooden crosses or stones carved with names. The trench had been dug in haste, by hands that could not stop trembling, by men who had long since forgotten ceremony, and by children who had seen too much to be children anymore. It had stretched once for nearly 60 feet, a crude line cut through soft earth at the farthest edge of the village, not chosen for any symbolic reason, but simply because it was far enough away from the houses, the wells, the chapel, and most importantly, from the eyes of those still hoping they would not be next. It was not consecrated ground. There had been no priest left to bless it. It was a pit, wide, damp, and necessary. The gravedigger stood at its edge now, or rather, at where the edge had once been, for time had done its best to cover the wound. Grass had grown over the soil, weeds had taken root in the crevices, and even a small birch tree now leaned drunkenly from one end of the sunken strip, as if it sprouted there not from seed, but from sorrow itself. But he could still see it, not with his eyes, but with the part of his mind that remembered how it had looked in those terrible weeks. The dark soil, the steam rising from the freshly turned earth, the smell that clawed its way into every fiber of clothing, and the silence that hovered not respectful, but exhausted. He had helped fill it. He had not been the only one. For a time, there were a handful of others, laborers who had once repaired roofs or split wood or carried stones, who now found themselves lifting bodies instead of lumber. They had not spoken much. Words seemed disrespectful. Instead, they moved in grim rhythm, cart to pit, pit to cart, their hands wrapped in cloth, their faces covered in whatever they could find, though nothing ever kept the sickness out. Some said it came from breath, others from touch. Some whispered it was punishment. Others said it was simply the wind's decision. But whatever it was, it lingered here. And here, in this place where names no longer mattered, they laid them, the old, the young, the unknown, all folded into the earth like pages of a book no one would ever read again. At first, they had tried to separate them, by family, by age, by what little dignity could be mustered. But that crumbled quickly. Soon it was just layers, cloth over cloth, skin against skin, the weight of one soul upon another until the trench filled, and the only thing left was to cover with soil and turn away. He stepped into the sunken middle now, boots brushing against grass that did not belong here, for nothing should have grown from such a place. Yet somehow, life always returned not triumphantly, but stubbornly, as though the earth could not help but remember how to breathe. The air was different down here, cooler, heavier, and still laced with the faintest trace of something sour and ancient, something that might not be real or perhaps was too real to name. He looked around slowly. No one else had come here in years. Even the most hardened scavengers avoided it, not from fear, from respect, from guilt, from the simple, unspoken understanding that here, beneath his feet, lay the part of the village no one wanted to speak of. He knelt in the center, placing a hand on the ground. It was damp as always. Even in dry seasons, the trench seemed to hold moisture the way a grave holds memory. He did not speak, not even silently in prayer, but the act itself, the contact, the stillness, became its own kind of reverence, a witness not to the individuals, but to the act, to the desperation that had made this place necessary. The sky above remained gray, soft and unchanging, casting no shadows, offering no warmth, but that felt fitting. This was not a place of light. It was a place of endurance, and in the stillness, he remembered them, not by name, not by face, but by gesture. A woman who had handed him her child and then disappeared. A boy who had insisted on helping, even as he coughed. A man who sang, once, quietly, as they lowered his wife into the earth. Fragments, echoes, the kinds of memories that make a life human, even when history forgets. The gravedigger stood once more, slowly, knees creaking in protest, and turned toward the ridge again. Not away from the trench, but toward what lay beyond, the edge of the valley, where the forest again once more thick and dark and waiting. There were no more bodies to bury, but still there were remnants to reckon with, for beyond death came the things left behind. He took one last look at the trench, now silent, now green, and then began to walk again, uphill this time, toward the shadows of the trees, where old shelters lay abandoned and relics of desperate survival lay hidden beneath moss and root. What people had done to live, that would be the next chapter. Up the slope he walked again, leaving behind the sunken field where memories of the dead lay blanketed beneath grass and guilt, and into the darker woods that once marked the edge of cultivated life, a kind of invisible border where gardens ended and the wild began. But in the year of famine, in the age of sickness, in the shadow of too many open graves, even this border had blurred. The forest had become not just a place of trees and birdsong, but a pantry for the desperate, a last refuge for those with mouths to feed and no bread left to offer. As he passed the first line of trees, their trunks dark with damp and their roots gnarled like clenched hands, he felt it again, that old quiet, not the peaceful hush of nature, but the waiting kind, the kind that feels like something watching. Here was where the hunger had made men strange. The gravedigger remembered the stories. He had heard them whispered in feverish tones in the early days, when bellies had only just begun to ache and people still believed the hardship would pass. Stories of boiled bark, of nettles and moss pounded into paste, of rats caught in traps and stewed over low fires while children cried themselves hoarse from the smell. At first, these tales had sounded like exaggerations, like the sort of wild rumors people tell make their own misery feel smaller. But then he had seen it for himself. Not all at once, and not always openly, but over time, as he moved from home to home, grave to grave, he began to notice things. The absence of livestock, not just from the fields, but from the bones. No dogs barking in the lanes. No cats slinking across rooftops. He saw window shutters nailed shut from the inside. Saw fire pits with bones too small for comfort. He saw the garden stripped bare of every root, every weed, every green thing that might once have been called edible. And he saw the look in people's eyes, not defiant, not pleading, but hollow. That hollow was what frightened him most. They ate whatever they could find. Acorns were gathered in sacks, soaked and crushed and baked into something that could be chewed. Dandelion roots were dug, dried, ground into powder, and mixed with whatever flour could still be scavenged. A flour made from beet pulp, from chestnuts, from old cornmeal scraped from the bottoms of long empty sacks. Porridges were made from boiled straw, thistle roots, powdered bark, and in some cases, the leather from old boots softened in water for hours until it could be gnawed without breaking teeth. Children were sent into the woods to forage, to scrape mushrooms from tree bark, to peel lichen from rocks, and scrape grubs from fallen logs. Not because they were brave, but because they were light and could go where others couldn't, and because hunger made cruelty ordinary. If the children returned empty-handed, they were sent again and again. The gravedigger passed a hollow now, where once a cottage had stood, the stones of its foundation still visible beneath the roots of a fallen tree. He remembered this place. A woman had lived here, alone after her sons went to the city and never returned. She had been one of the first to begin gathering from the woods. He remembered the way she had offered him soup once, thin, cloudy broth, smelling faintly of boiled grass. He had thanked her and refused. Later, someone told him she'd been seen cooking crows. Farther in, the path narrowed, winding between boulders and brambles. He followed it without needing to think, for his feet knew the way better than his eyes. Here, in a clearing just beyond a fallen wall, he had once found a circle of stones, a fire pit, with bones still blackened inside. He could not say what kind they were. He did not ask, but the smell had clung to his cloak for days. The hunger had broken something in people, not just their bodies, but their sense of what was right. It wasn't that they stopped caring. It was that they stopped remembering. Etiquette, tradition, rules, all of it faded when the ribs pressed too sharply against the skin, when mother looked at her child and knew the only choice was between shame and death. And in that space, between shame and death, terrible things bloomed like fungi in the dark. He reached another spot now, where the trees thinned slightly and a pile of stones rose beside the trail. Not a grave, not a cairn, just stones. Someone had once tried to cook here. A few burned sticks still lay beneath the pile, along with the warped remnants of a copper pot, green with age. He stood for a moment, looking down at it, and wondered if the person had eaten, or if they had only hoped to, because sometimes hope was all that was cooked. He thought of the man who'd eaten grass until his stomach distended, who had clawed at his belly as if the roots were growing inward. He thought of the girl who'd been found chewing paper, of the boy who, in the end, simply lay down beside the garden and never stood up again. These were not dramatic deaths, not like plague, not like war. These were quiet endings, slow, brittle, hidden in corners. Even those who survived, he knew, had paid a price. Their eyes never softened again. Their hands always shook in spring, when the crops were still small. They saved everything, hoarded scraps, counted bites, licked bowls clean and never threw away peelings, because the memory of that hunger never left. Not ever. He knelt beside the old fire pit now, ran his fingers through the moss growing along the base, and felt something hard beneath. A stone bowl, perhaps. He left it. It belonged to the past, to the ones who had eaten out of it not for pleasure, not for sustenance, but simply because it was what there was. And then he rose once more, brushing earth from his knees, and looked past the trees to the horizon, the line where the forest ended and the broken fields began again. Beyond that, the village waited, quieter now than ever, but still there, and the final chapter still waited to be faced. Because even in a world of hunger, silence, and burial, the living were not always the most fortunate. The trees thinned behind him as he stepped out of the forest's quiet grip, its branches still rustling softly behind him like a sigh of farewell. Not sorrowful, but relieved, as though the woods themselves were grateful to be unburdened of their grim secrets for a little while. Before him now stretched the land once again, no longer the raw wilderness of bark and root, but not yet the order of village paths or tilled gardens either. It was the in-between, where old fields lay fallow and fences had long since slouched into the earth, their posts gray and lichen-covered, pointing not toward property anymore, but simply toward forgetting. The sun hung low in the sky, a dim coin behind wool-colored clouds, offering no warmth, but just enough light to mark the hour, a light that revealed the outlines of the world in gentle tones, all of it worn and soft, like a place too tired to resist being remembered. And ahead, past a shallow hillock and the faint line of dry stone walls that barely held themselves together, sat the village. It had not changed much. Not in the way that cities change, with walls rising and towers falling and markets spilling out into new lanes. No, This place had changed quietly, the kind of change that shows itself in absence rather than addition. Fewer houses stood now than before. Of those that remained, many bore shuttered windows and sagging roofs, doors that had never been repaired, chimneys that no longer smoked. The sound of children, once shrill and unstoppable, was gone. Not just hushed, but vanished. The animals had returned in small numbers, a few thin goats, a bird perched lazily on a broken post, a dog slinking between shadows. But even their movements were subdued, as if remembering still what it meant to be hungry. And yet, the village lived. Not all of it, not loudly, but it lived. He passed the old well, where the pulley still hung but the rope had rotted, the bucket missing, and thought of hands that had drawn water there long ago, and the last time those hands had touched another's. He walked by the baker's ruin. Its oven crumbled, the smell of bread long faded. But he remembered the woman who had once stood there, singing to herself, and how she'd given crust to children before her own larder emptied. They were gone now, all of them, but not entirely, not while someone still remembered. At the village square, he paused. It was not a grand place, just a widening of the main path, where a crooked bench leaned against an elder tree, and the last remnants of a market stall sat draped in the bleached cloth of years. Here, he had once watched a man collapse, not from plague, not from violence, but simply from emptiness. Hunger, exhaustion, grief. It had all converged upon him in one final moment, and he had fallen like a leaf let go by the tree. No one had run to catch him, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't. The village by then had already used the last of its strength. But even then, even after so much, some had endured, not because they were stronger, not because they were luckier, but because survival, like hunger, is not a thing of merit. It simply is. And those who found themselves still breathing after all was done did not celebrate. They did not cheer or weep. They simply continued. He saw one now. The old smith, bent nearly in half, his forge cold, his hands too gnarled to lift a hammer anymore. But he swept his doorstep each morning. He kept the nails in neat rows on a shelf no one used. He fed the crow that came to visit him at dusk. There was a widow, too, eyes like glass, knees stiff from cold, but she still spun thread on her spindle, slow and steady, as if the act itself was a way to keep time from stopping altogether. She did not speak to many, but once each week she lit a candle and left it by the chapel ruins. Not for prayer, but for memory. Children were fewer now, but not gone. Two small ones ran between the trees near the square, chasing something invisible, laughing in a way that almost sounded brave. They had not known the full weight of what had come before. They knew only the quiet that followed, and in that quiet, they were learning to grow again. And in each home that still held warmth, no matter how small, something else lived as well. The knowledge that survival was not a reward. It was a responsibility. The gravedigger knew this better than most. He had outlived the plague. He had outlived the famine. He had buried the strangers, the friends, the family, and still he walked, not proudly, not out of stubbornness, but because someone must, because the stories do not tell themselves. The memories do not carry themselves forward. The silence does not break itself. And so he moved, quietly, steadily, through the village like a shadow with purpose, his steps not heavy but meaningful. He did not preach. He did not scold. He simply remembered. And in remembering, he gave weight to the lives that had flickered and gone. He gave shape to the void they left behind. Because survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the next one. A story not about kings or armies or triumph, but about those who stayed, about those who woke each morning, even when there was no bread, who sang to children, even when their voices cracked, who planted, even when the earth gave nothing back, who hoped, quietly in corners, even when everything else had been taken. These were the survivors, not because they chose to be, but because they had no other choice. And their lives, small as they may seem in the pages of history, held the whole weight of the world.